Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Claudio Amitrano. I am the Director of Macroeconomics Studies and Policy at IPEA, the Institute for Applied Economic Research here in Brazil. I'm really glad to be here in this session and actually in this whole conference. It's a pleasure. I would like to thank Ricardo Suma for inviting me and IPEA as well. This afternoon we'll discuss in this session structuralism, political economy and demand-led growth in LA. Demand-led growth, sorry. And we will have today Professor Carlos Pinkusfeld from UFRJ and also President of the International Center for Development, Celso Furtado. We'll have as well Professor Matias Vernengo from Bucknell University, and also Dr. Esteban Perez Caldentey from ECLAC, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Pinkusfeld.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Claudio, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for this invitation. I have just to apologize because my voice is usually not very clear or very good, as well as my English is today is even worse because I have a flu and have a sore throat. So sorry for this. Anything that could get worse than should be. Okay, this is my presentation. I think it will be on the Latin American structuralism and the surplus approach. The idea is to try to map that Latin American structuralism is something that appeared in the second half of the 20th century, sorry. It has a lot of important impacts on our profession and the reflection of Brazilian and Latin American economists, and it was a very huge importance in this sense. Had some very important ideas, new ideas that broke with the orthodoxy at the time, but also has some problems, has some limitations. And I think the majority of people that were not in our meeting last Friday, that were me, Claudio, and Matias, and I want, just because, to begin with the table, that's in the article by Matias 2022. It's on variety of capitalism. And what I'm trying to do here is to reach at the last column of this division in terms of interpretations of variety of capitalism. So I think what we try to do, at least we Latin American economists and people that are trying to follow the steps of our masters, is to reach an interpretation that combine the seminal ideas of those founding fathers and some contributions theoretical contributions that have been made in recent years. So what I'm trying to do, I will try to do, is to make like a history of economic thought, beginning of this, the very basic ideas and reaching of this, what Matias calls structural Keynesian. I call it modern surplus approach. Some may call it Raffianism, whatever. But the name is not important. Important is the ideas that are behind this approach, the modern structuralism in Latin America. Okay, so the motivation, the first one is there is a connection between development theory and the classical political economy. It's embedded in development theory. What I mean by development theory is the traditional Lewis, Nursi, and Rosenstein-Rodin, is the 1950s traditional development theory. So I'll show why. This theory, it has to go back to classical political economy. It's not a neoclassical approach. And of course, Latin American structuralism shares some of the main features with this development theory. Of course, they were born at the same time. That people, they are connected. Of course, the most important is connection is the Singer-Prebisch theory. The Singer was not a Latin American economist, and Prebisch, so there's this, cross-pollinization of these authors, and they have been here. I will mention an article by Nurks that was a debate that he was invited to Brazil, and they have this discussion with Furtado, and the debate is published. I have an article on this debate. So there's not just the affiliation of the structuralist ideas. They are more than just minds that are oriented to the same idea. It's something that happened in the real terms, in the meetings and seminars. And if CEPAL, what's ECLAC, right? Let's say CEPAL, was an institution funded by the UN. So it's, in institutional terms, they are very connected to. Okay, so, but besides being like related theories or something that they grew at the same time, I'll try to examine the particularities in relation to the three elements of these theories, and particularities and the difference, okay? The first is the general methodological approach, and then the issues related to growth and capital accumulation and inflation. I think we agree with that. Something that is definitely defines what is heterodox or orthodox is the model of growth or capital accumulation and the theory of inflation. Those basic elements are crucial to understand or to identify what is an orthodox or neoclassical marginalist theory and what is not. So the basic idea is the beginning. Of course, the first step would be the methodological aspects, and then I will explore some topics on the traditional development theory and show how it's different from our structuralist Latin American theory. Okay, so I think that the connection of the structuralism and the classical theories is quite obvious. This is the definition. I will not, for this audience, define also the surplus approach. It's not necessary. But anyway, it's the appropriation. The surplus does not occur in a vacuum, but reflects the specific material conditions, society, technical conditions of production, class relations, and elements of geography and geopolitics. Matias was talking about geography, how important it is to take into consideration, and something that's very important also for the structuralist authors. And different countries have, of course, different institutions, and all the mix of all these elements are very important to explain the different trajectories or the history of the economy of each country. So the formations, as I mentioned, is expression of historical condition. So this is the choice that made by Latin American structuralist approach. It's very much almost directly the methodological political economy, traditional conventional political economy. So it's something obvious and very important. That's probably the stuff that should keep from this approach. Even with, let's say, I'll try to show that we can correct or can change parts of this approach. This is very important, and it's before the surplus approach become as influential as it's now. So it's something quite remarkable, in my opinion, for these Latin American authors to think a theoretical approach like that. And so I'll bring to the traditional development theory. So I'll put the seminar arc of economic development with a limited supply of labor as probably the most important article for this approach. And it's departure from marginalist assumptions. And something very important, Lewis, he recognized the existence of a duality in the labor market, which reflects, and is a reflection, of course, of different production structures, with the modern sector, which is the capitalized sector, and one that works, live and make their living with little capital. It's important, of course, to describe the situation. It's very. He has this idea. I think walking in the streets of one city in I think it was in Bangkok. Thank you. In Bangkok, he was walking and said, "Oh, that's what duality is about." This is funny because he had the idea in Bangkok, and he describes in his article when he came back to his country, Santa Lucia, and people always says that this model is about agriculture and urban, and the idea came from completely different, and he writes a totally different story, but people helping him out in Santa Lucia. That's when he was in Santa Lucia, the capital of Santa Lucia, not like the countryside of Santa Lucia. Anyway, just a side note. But so, in one sense, it's an important description of what he understands, what was the nature of underdevelopment or underdeveloped countries. But at the same time, it's an important element to have an exogenous substances wage, which for him is a way to go back to the classical approach. So wages are not defined by supply and demand or the scarcity of labor, and then he goes back to a theoretical background, which is classical, which is wages is not determined by the supply and demand, and the problem with this model, and the problem, in my opinion, with the whole development theory, we talked to Matias also why they did that. Maybe they did that because they need to. They need to work in universities in the first world. They don't like very much Marxists, so it's nothing like that. But anyway, it's important because it changed the very nature of the model, of the understanding of the workings of the economy. But at the same time, is a theory that it has to the theory will end as the situation ends. So as the employment in the modern sector grows, and there's no more infinite supply of labor, it's not a theory. It's a theory for a specific case, which is good in some sense, but it's not. It's just a provisional theory that will end as soon as the underdevelopment ends. So, and that's the problem. So it's a return to the classical theory as a classical approach, but is a return with some limited validity of this theory. As soon as there's no more, as soon as the scarcity of labor kicks in. The second important part of the theory is same thing, is the imperfections. And at this point, Matias, I'm not sure that you can put these people in the second column, maybe the radical second column people. Close to the third. Okay. Anyway, but they say that the underdevelopment economies, they have a lot of market failures, and they talk about the pecuniary externalities, which is something that I don't think theoretically is very solid. But anyway, those failures, they prevented the economies from following the normal process of marginal orthodoxy, and ultimately justify the public sector interventions. So once again, whatever is the model, is the balanced growth or unbalanced growth or any kind of intervention, they are crucial because the economy doesn't work like a regular or normal economy should be. There are more externalities than a normal capitalist economy would have. So once again, is a theory, is a model that has a valid period validity very short. As soon as it ends the underdevelopment situation. It just should go back to the traditional orthodox marginalist model. And then it enters the center-periphery model, which is at the center of, no, sorry, that was not a pun, of the theory of the structuralist theory. Of course, the central point is in the trilogy of manifestos by Perez, is the distinction between peripheral and central economies, which refers to way countries have been placed in the international division of labor because of the different productive structures. It's clear that it's different. Of course, the idea that I put in my first slide, that the history is important, structure is important, relations of geopolitics and geography is important, it's much more than just I'll go back to classical approach because I need an exogenous real wage. It's much deeper and much more related to what I think is the real classical approach. So at this point, from the start, I think there's a difference here, and the difference is clear. So the relationship between the periphery and the center is examined in light of these characteristics. And of course, the deterioration of terms of trade, it's a limiting factor. Of course, I didn't put here, for me, the most important element in terms of trade is the elasticity problem. But anyway, it became more famous, the problem of deterioration of terms of trade. So the industrialization was not something that you should pursue just because it's good, because that's the way to evade the trap of underdevelopment. And in this particular case of center periphery, it's the trap of the external trade and the tendency of external constraint. So what I'm saying is this: the CPAO or ECLAC analytical think is the methodology is very clear that they have much more historical description and should be more, it's like, in this sense, much more closer to the original classical approach than the traditional development theory. Let's talk about capital accumulation. According to Lewis, of course, they go back to the classical model with something that we might find good, the historical approach, the classes are important and everything, the exogenous wage, but they keep the Say's law that that was present in the traditional classical political economy. And Lewis' explicitness is that Keynesian theory, when applied to underdeveloped countries or countries with surplus labor, is but a footnote to neoclassicism, albeit a long, important, and fascinating footnote. He says that since they don't have a limited supply of land and capital, so the Keynesian theory is not useful for underdeveloped economies. Of course, all the time he thinks about limitations of savings, which is something that will be through not just his work, but all the development authors, and unfortunately, the vast majority of Latin American structuralist authors too. So something that was kept from the original idea, something not very good. So the economy is supply constrained rather than demand constrained. And once the way that they eliminate the dualism, since they have the subsistent wage, when you start to use more productive or mechanized methods, the profit rate would be higher, and the higher profit, the level of profits would be higher anyway, and the higher the level of profits will be more investment, more capitalization, and this is a positive effect. And at the end, when you have this acceleration of growth with increase of capitalization, people from this, the labor, the traditional supply, elastic supply of labor will be incorporated in the modern sector, and the modern sector just encompass the whole labor market, and as I mentioned, is the end of the model. So you can go back to Solo's model. But anyway, the point more important to me is that, of course, he used Say's law, because once you have like profits, larger profits, you immediately invest all those profits, and you have the growth because you have like traditional Say's law. So it's embedded in Lewis' logic, is Say's law, and the limitation of savings as the limit, the most important limit for growth. And related to this is the importance of the conspicuous consumption and the impact in the development process. This conspicuous consumption will eat part of the surplus that otherwise should be invested. So the limitation of growth, since he has Say's law, there's no problem of demand, is that if the conspicuous consumption eats or part of the surplus that is growing because the wages are given and they're like larger or greater mechanization of the economy, so that's something, there's a limitation of growth from the saving side, given this conspicuous consumption. And this specific topic that's very important for NURCS, for all the theory, it was discussed, as I mentioned, there was a meeting in Rio de Janeiro, and NURCS was here, and Furtado here, they have this give and take that was published after that. And Furtado doesn't contradict NURCS. Although he makes a lot of important comments, I think he makes a lot of the connection between this consumption and external imbalances and other things that are much more sophisticated, let's say, Furtado, because Furtado is within this tradition of Latin American structuralism. He doesn't contradict NURCS in this point. So, in the end, Furtado also thinks that the economy is supply constrained. And another step that you can show that Furtado has this idea is his model, what we call the development within development. Of course, I'm just limiting myself to this point of Furtado approach. He makes a lot of interesting comments about employment, how this development in Latin America was not able to pick up the great part of the population out of poverty, or to provide good jobs for the vast majority of the population. It's not that what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that his model, it has the connection between that the sectors that the development strategy was creating in Latin America, what higher capital product ratio or capital labor ratio, and given the savings, since the V would go up, so the rate of growth would go down. So of course, it's a supply side model. It's not a demand side model by any chance. And he has the stagnation interpretation, which is much more complicated and interesting in terms of interaction between supply and demand sides. But anyway, it's just a radicalization of his first model, that they need declining of profits, but it follows the same supply side growth model. So Furtado couldn't. Let me say something that's important. Furtado, of course, he wrote a lot of things after that paper. And it's important because Matias mentioned something interesting, that Perez was considered Perez was considered an author of dependency theory, something that he was not. But it's important because dependency theory, and Furtado has an article and a book, in fact, in 1972, that mentioned this idea of dependency. It's something that it comes from the center-periphery idea, basic idea. So he changed his mind. What I'm just trying to say, that his basic growth model is not a demand-led growth model. That's basically what I try to say. And then I mentioned Perez, that I think Matias will talk about that. But Furtado, since the first article, Perez, 1949, he says the problem that most Latin American countries' savings are scarce, while modern technology requires higher per capita income. The problem that didn't exist in original industrializations when low savings rates were compatible with techniques that had lower per capita capital requirements. So from the beginning, I think that Prebisch was also adhering to the traditional classical model of growth. And then I will quote Perez, Caldentey, and Vernengo. While it's true that Prebisch seemed to embrace the notion of the surplus, arguably closer to the analytical structure of classical authors and Marx, he did it in a way that implied the acceptance of Say's law, the notion that profits or savings determine accumulation, potential, or investment. So it's page 250 of this article by those two gentlemen here. And this was very interesting to me, that in this footnote at the same page, they mention that Prebisch in 1981 also advocates the idea that wasteful consumption patterns are detrimental to accumulation and growth, which, as we argued above, is an important element to both classical development theory and Furtado's criticism of the patterns of consumption in Brazil. So I guess that Prebisch is very much, but I don't know, Matias will develop this point. So something that happened, just to mention that after this, the basic theory in the 50s, there was a change in Latin American tradition, the structuralist tradition, that they kind of adopted the Cambridge theory of growth, influenced by Caldo. It's funny, the story why Furtado went to, to Cambridge is because he met with Caldo in Mexico. And Caldo was writing his famous article, The Theories of Distribution, and showed to Furtado the article and said, I think we're doing something really very connected. We're not the same thing, but we work on some issues, the same problems. In fact, I think Furtado was not working this way, as much more the limitation for growth and not inflation. But anyway, but he saw this, and Furtado went to Cambridge. Okay, oops, sorry, but he didn't, in fact, use that. Anyway, I will just jump this part because the Cambridge theory of growth is a problem. And there's an important influence in Latin America developmentalist thinking. You have quotes in this article that I will finish from Conceição Santavares, Carlos Lessa, several authors. So this was very important. It wasn't not anymore the classical approach. Was a demand-led model. However, is a demand-led with problems of savings. So the savings adjustment would be given by inflation. So it's a little bit different, but I'll just mention in passing that something very important for the theory of the structuralism, Latin America, is inflation. Why it was so important? Because they have a practical step to fight against the normal stabilization policies that were imposed by IMF. So they just so I think you mentioned it, that the structuralist approach, in fact, it's a consequence in part of the idea of inflation being based on structural factors. So it's very important. I don't have time to go through this point, but anyway, there are it's a problem. It's not a problem of aggregate demand. It's a problem of supply and demand in special sectors, and then you have this mismatch or this inconsistency between the supply and demand. And there are two maybe sectors that are more important. First is the food, the bottleneck in agriculture, and the second, that for me is more important, is the external conditions that would generate problems of exchange rate devaluation and inflation. So this is more traditional. And I have this big problem with the primary causes and the propagation mechanism. I think it's something very bad in this theory. The primary cause would be one of the two, the sector imbalance of the agriculture and the external constraint. And the propagation mechanism will be monetary policy and government deficit. It was very conventional, very conventional. They think that is necessary. Of course, at last, in Latin America, at this period of time, money, government financing was not by debt. But anyway, it's a very monetarist model they have to, at least when they deal with the propagation mechanisms. And just to finish, I have this, of course, the modern surplus approach that we have nowadays. It's easy, it's just to use the demand model and avoid the limitation imposed by both the classical and the forced savings growth models, and keep the good part of it. Of course, the more recently distributive conflict models are much more, I think they're much more general, and they avoid the problems of the so-called propagation mechanism. I think they are legitimate and true heterodox models. And of course, at the time they are talking about the limitations of agriculture and food prices, it's something that we're not finding in Brazil. I don't think that was in Argentina. And just maybe a particular problem to Chile, I guess. Even in Mexico, I'm not so sure. So it's very particular instead of having like a broader and more general approach that the new, or the theory of conflict, distributive conflict models they give to us. But nevertheless, we're not should lose of these important insights that we have the structuralist approach, and the importance of the productive structures and the public policies that can change in them. And something that I mentioned, and Franklin comment about our meeting last Friday, and maybe there's misunderstandings in the relationship between economic growth and structural change and development theory and development of growth. So I just will leave with the one example to me that is a good example on how sometimes it should be clarified, then we can have a more consistent and continuous from our founding fathers. And we have this Sunkel, is the hero of my good friend Matias, and he says that what matters isn't demand and markets. The core of development lies in supply, quality, flexibility, and efficient combination of use of productive resources and adoption of technology progress, a spirit of innovation and creativity, public and private thrift, and the emphasis of savings and development of capabilities to compete internationally. In short, the independent effort from within the achieve self-sustaining development. It's 1993. So we should clarify these points, and you can use without any kind of remorse the ideas that were given to us to those very important economists. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. We will collect questions at the end of all three speeches. Matias.
Thank you for the invitation. First of all, let me thank everybody, Suma, Franklin, Carlinhos, and Amitrano, Claudio, that they conspired to bring us, me and Esteban, here. So this is a super conference, and we're very happy to be here. What I'm going to try to talk a little bit, I'm going to escape a little bit. I'm going to say something because Carlinhos sort of got me into this structural Keynesian thing, so I'm going to say something about that. But and my peculiar interpretation, me and my peculiar interpretations put me always in trouble. I refer to the Caldentey supermultiplier, and I have both Mark and Franklin very angry at me. So both, well, now he's angry because I said he's angry. So things are getting worse and worse. But the point is, I've been chastised by saying Caldentey, and I want to explain why a little bit, and we'll say a couple of things on that. But really, the idea of this is taking, as you see, role privilege between external constraint and stagnation, is talk a little bit about and follow up on what Carlinhos said, and talk about if you want, the sort of origins, the genealogy of the demand sort of led view that reaches UFRJ eventually, and builds into the idea of the super multiplier. So a little bit of the history of thought through the lens of Prebic. And why Prebic? Because me and Esteban, we spend too much time reading Prebic at this point to not use it for writing papers. We have like, how many papers? Like 16, 17 papers on this. And if I wasn't slow, we have a manuscript that it's ready, and we have to publish on a book on Prebic in Spanish. So it's my fault, not his fault, that the book is not published. And this is one of the arguments of the book, and I think it sheds some light on a discussion that, I think follows. I should say I have a paper on Conceição Tavares that sort of is the other leg of this, how we move from the Prebic of the 50s and 60s to an attempt to move to demand-led and eventually to the super multiplier. But not all of that is here. This is just the Prebic part. So what I'm going to discuss is a little bit the trajectory of Prebic and the overall trajectory of Prebic. And what I want to suggest is that the conventional view of Prebic is somewhat incorrect. And the way we tend to read Prebic, clouds, even in some sense what Carlinhos was saying, of a very supply-side sort of person, ends up being something that it's more of the late Prebic than something that, it's, necessarily, central to his ideas or to structuralism. So I'm going to discuss a little bit the ideas of the young Prebic and its relation to the UN and ECLAC, the ECLAC UNTAC period and what happens afterwards. A little bit of, here I shouldn't put it in these terms, it's somewhat more ideological than analytical. So what we mean here, more radical, less radical, is says law versus effective demand. So I think he moves from a view that it's compatible with effective demand, and he was Keynesian, and he's one of the first to read Keynes, and we're not to a view that, it is essentially compatible. I don't think neoclassical version of says law, but certainly with some classical, although he was eclectic, so he certainly was eclectic with classical views of says law. And then, sort of conclude with, some concluding thoughts on this broader sort of issue of the origins of. So before I get here, structural Keynesian. Why the term and not classical Keynesian, as many Sraffians use? Why not Sraffian? And the reason for structural Keynesian is the following. So remember that the table that he put at the beginning, it's a table on a book on varieties of capitalism. So that is a dialogue with very different people than the ones we are normally used to. So it is the famous book by Hall and Soskice when, the political scientists discover that, it's only one game in town, it's capitalism. And then it's people like Mark Blythe and Lucio Baccaro and Jonas Pontusson and so on and so forth. They're all in the book that, the only one that couldn't participate, but he replied, the image was very nice, was John Hall, but we have Soskice and all the others are in the book. And the reason for this is that our point in our paper is that the way of doing political economy is to go back to classical political economy and the surplus approach. So it's a Sraffian perspective on that. With a caveat that the classical authors did not have a distinction between center and periphery. And that is brought up by Prebic and the Latin American structurists. So we go back to the classical authors with effective demand in the long run, but also with differences between center and periphery, because the restrictions that are forced on you are very different if you're center and periphery. And so that's the origin of the term structural Keynesian and why we like that particular term, because it puts all of those things in one name. So, and I'll say something about the Caldorian later on, so I promise to come here. So, first of all, the first of those things, it's Prebic himself gives you a history of thought of himself. So he has a famous little paper in which says the 5 stages of my economic thinking. So it's not in the air what he thought about his evolution. And he is the guy that creates the myth. So if you read his story about himself, he was a neoclassical guy. And then, he sees the light, in his way to Santiago, not to Damascus, and sort of changes his views. But he's constrained by the UN position, and he cannot say all the things he wanted to say in that particular period, at the UN, first at ECLAC, and then at UNCTAD. And it's only when he comes out at the other end of this, and he's 70 years old, and he founds the ECLAC Review, the journal, and publishes his only book. Peripheral Capitalism was published in 1983. It's a collection of papers that appeared for the most part before in ECLAC Review over the 70s, so it's the last stage of his thinking. That's when he thinks he's radicalized and he has sort of finally become more heterodox and so on and so forth. So that's his own history of how he sort of developed his ideas. And, off the bat, when you read early Prebic is a very hard guy to, another thing to say. So if you read Prebic, one of the problems with Prebic is that Prebic doesn't cite anybody. So it's all coming from the revealed word of himself. And so it's very hard to know where things come from. And we have hints. We know with whom he studied. We know certain things he read. But it's not direct. It's not. So there is a certain amount of guesswork. So we say certain things here that we are explicit. We believe that this is what's going on, but we have no complete proof of this because he's his own man. And so, for example, we know it's not here in this paper, but we know that his Keynesian ideas probably come from the fact that when he signed, he was not a dependency theorist, and in Argentina, and there are many Argentinians here, he's seen as, a man of the elites and of the rural elites and very conservative. And he was there in the signing of a famous, treaty, Roca-Runciman, in which, Argentina sort of basically, it's a free trade agreement, we export, beef and wheat, and we import manufactured goods in the middle of the Depression. And he's there in the signing of this. It was for the London 1933, monetary conference that trying to reorganize the international financial system, that it's a complete failure. And he reads three pieces in the Times of London by Keynes, the Means to Prosperity. So that becomes a little pamphlet. So we know the origin of how much he read Herod and the Trade Cycle, we're not sure. But it's likely that he was aware of its existence. So he develops an idea, and I don't know if Esteban will talk about that, I don't think so, but he develops an idea of a foreign trade kind of multiplier. But it's very likely that he did read Herod. So that's there, so in the origins of those things. So he was more eclectic. He had read neoclassical things. He had read Marx. He had debates with the Argentinian socialists. The Socialist Party in Argentina was very strong. The first translation of Capital to Spanish was not done in Spain, was not done in Mexico. Mexico has much more tradition, one would think, of publication and whatnot, and more widespread for the whole region. It was done in Argentina by, I think, a son of an Italian immigrant, and we had also the first socialist in Congress and so on and so forth. So those things show the strength of these ideas. And he had debates with Jaime Justo, the translator of Capital in the 30s. So his ideas, and he was close to Augusto Bunge, and so all of those things suggest that the idea of Prebic as a neoclassical guy are exaggerated. Here, a little footnote. I'm not sure if I should delve into this footnote, but it's an important thing that we do say and we do in the book. It's also important to note, traditionally, and I would agree with Carlinhos, that the most fundamental thing actually is the elasticity issue, and I think that appears later on. But there is an element of the more widespread and popular notion of the terms of trade that I think it's important. First of all, a question of the origins of that argument. And so two prominent sort of authors, father and son, John and Richard Toy, suggested that Prebic did not come with this idea, and it's wholly, based on Hans Singer. And on top of this, when he talks about this idea, it's of cyclical nature and never of a trend. So, and you have here the quote from that. By the way, Singer was sort of a student of Keynes. He had taken classes with Keynes, the seminar in the 30s, before going to the UN. So there is sort of the cross-fertilization is sort of broader also because Keynes, Prebic is learning Keynes and will publish the first sort of guide to Keynes, so there are many guides to Keynes in English, in other languages. The first in Spanish is done by Prebic in 47, so relatively early on when he's out of the central bank. And so as you see here, the quote, he says, he saw it as a feature, this is from the toys, they saw it as a feature of the depression economics that is a short-run cyclical phenomenon. And in 1931 or 1933, it's 31, the Pravich thing on terms of trade? 31. So this is considerably before anything that Hans Singer wrote on this, and these were quoted. So here you have, it's our translation of this. This is in Spanish. The collapse in prices does not constitute the usual phenomenon of cyclical reaction, rather an intense and pertinent decline to positions each time far away from the level on which develop the relations of production and credit. And then he continues. That decline, is not simply a return to a previous situation, but an accentuated and progressive contraction of values that violently upsets the economic structure of the country. So we're saying it's trend, not cycle. So he knew this in 1931. He thought about that in 1931. He's thinking of what I think is the distinctive characteristic of the 49 paper is that there is a change in the geopolitical relations that would make Argentina now need to readjust and organize its production structure to a new hegemonic center, not England anymore, that the United States that produces commodities like Argentina, and our patterns of specialization are not adapted to this particular sort of situation. He will think also on the patterns of consumption, but that's sort of which was what Carlinhos was talking about. So I think that that's one of the distinctive characteristics. What else is important in this? That I think I say later on, or I don't. So I don't, so I'll say it here. The other thing that it's important in this, I think, is that when you look at the 49 paper, so there is another discussion there with the toys, which is minor, because there are two drafts of the paper. Furtado in his memoirs in the Fantasia Organizada, God knows how you translate that, but in his memoirs he says that Pravich first presented a paper, and the paper wasn't particularly radical, and then that paper vanished, nobody ever saw it again, and the published version sort of appeared. Furtado translated into Portuguese, was initially published in Portuguese before it was ever published in Spanish or English. So the first time you could read Pravich, the more radical Pravich supposedly is in Portuguese. And so the toys suggest that that's because he read in between the Singer report, and that's what radicalized and Pravich. So if you read carefully, what Furtado says is that the tone of the manifesto, it's called manifesto sometimes, the development manifesto, had changed, but not the ideas. And as we saw, the ideas there are in 31, he already has this sort of idea. He also says in that 49 manifesto that the reason for the terms of trade fallen, it's the, perhaps I do have it much later in the paper, so let me see. No, I don't. That's annoying. Oops, let's go back. Oh. So the reason for that is that it's related to wages. And the notion is that when you have a boom in the center and in the periphery, wages go up, but in the recession, the wages in the periphery tend to fall. And because there is more bargaining power in the center, those wages hold. And as they hold, because of bargaining power, very classical sort of argument. You see, he's concerned here with distribution as a conflictive thing. That would generate eventually what? Differentiation associated to those different levels of wages that tend to subsistence in the periphery and not the case in the center. So there is an element in his eclecticism, in his sort of not sort of direct sort of way of looking at things, that he has a foot on the classical sort of authors. He always has this foot. Sometimes, neoclassical stuff appears, but very often he has explanations. And the main explanation in the 49 paper is that one that I gave you. And so it's not, a technological argument. It is based on distribution on fairly reasonably classical sort of lines, which he probably, sort of having read Marx and so on and so forth and other classical authors. He read certainly those in the original. So that's the story of the manifesto. And of course in the manifesto, that is used to discuss not just, so the elasticity problem will appear more firmly actually in one paper that's much worse in many ways, which is the 59 one in the American Economic Review. in a little sort of example. If you look at the numerical example, Thirlwell's law is there. You have really the growth rates on both sides of center and periphery. You have the income elasticity of exports and the income elasticity, the rate of growth of exports, on one side if you want, and the income elasticity of imports on the other side. And he makes a numerical example. So the idea of Thirlwell's law is there in 59 for sure. And what is central to his ECLAC UNTACT sort of period, oh no, it's here. So the argument of wages is right here, so boo. So you should look at what you produce before you come and present. Lesson number 1. Yes, read Vernengo. So, but what he does there is not come up, so I would agree with Carlinhos that there is no demand-led story here. He still remains an eclectic guy. He certainly thought that these patterns of consumption were important and played a role, but they're not particularly concerned with this. He's concerned with this geopolitical thing. And mind you, we don't put enough importance in this. He is the first person, we tend to cite Kindleberger, and I'm fine with Kindleberger. And everybody says Kindleberger is the guy that saw that, the Great Depression was caused by geopolitical causes. It's not just, money supply contracted. It's also not just consumption fell. Is that England, cannot manage the world economy, and the United States doesn't want to manage the economy. What I'm telling you is Prebisch saw that, from the lens, not the Depression, from the lens of Argentina. We're switching the geopolitical center of the economy, the global economy, and we're in trouble because our sort of organization is not prepared for that. So he was concerned with industrialization because it was a need of the circumstances of Argentina. We don't do that, we cannot raise wages, which is development. So for him, development is raising those wages in the periphery. So I always say, it doesn't matter you're growing, your wages are stagnated, that's not development. It's not just catching up, at least. So you have to catch up and, with the center, but you also have to raise the living standards of the poor in your country. And Prebisch had that clear, in some sense. And so, so what he's doing during this period is he's thinking as the external restrictions. So he has to industrialize. How do you do that? Well, it's complicated. The joke I used to say, I stopped saying it because, some kid showed me the video of that, but, it's porcupine sex, which I imagine was slow and carefully. So it's not, it's regular. So, but the point is, how do you do industrialization? It's a difficult process. So you have to, it's trial and error, you have to all of those complicated things, and you hit very, very early on, so the external restriction. The model is not a demand-led model, in the sense that he doesn't even have a model. So when he has a little model, if you call that example, numerical example in 59 a model, it can be interpreted in many ways. Krugman interprets that story as a supply constraint, the 45-degree line. So I think he thought in terms of something that it's broadly demand. He knew history. Historians tended to think more of demand. But we have no evidence. I don't think that the debate between supply versus demand was particularly formed at that time. So I'm more than happy to those that are more growth. But in my view, demand-led models appear as a reaction to some extent to Solow. So I think that it's by the 70s, heterodox people start thinking along those lines. Perhaps I'm wrong. John Robinson, perhaps, is trying to think along those lines, even in the 50s. But I'm not gonna discuss that one here. I'm not sure about that. The important element for us is the following, and we'll say something about the Caldorian part. So in this period, as Carlinhos said, Caldor and Kalecki come to ECLAC, and so they meet all of these people, and there is some cross-fertilization. Furtado ends at, exactly because of that meeting, he ends writing the classic book on Brazil in Cambridge. And Caldor also, he goes to Chile. So he doesn't just go to Mexico. When he goes to Chile, he writes a little paper that gets not published. It cannot get published because it's too radical for people from ECLAC being able to say what they think. And so, I didn't say anything. So, poor people at ECLAC. But what is that paper? The paper says that the problem of Latin American development is exactly it's the stagnationist thesis. So it's the patterns of consumption. So we have a problem with the patterns of consumption and the patterns of production. We're forced to import all of the, consumption of the elites. We export these commodities. You do have these terms of trade that sort of go against you, or the elasticities, whatever the version of the argument. But it eats your surplus, and so there is an inimical relationship between consumption and investment. And so this is why you cannot invest, because you have too much consumption of the elites. And that's in Caldor, whatever the year of that was, 58, I think. Again, not published. And that certainly, Prebic read that paper, and he was involved in the discussions that didn't allow that to be published. He probably did try to get it published. They couldn't get it published. I'm not sure that that's the source. Again, Prebic's not telling you things, so we don't know what's the source of Prebic's ideas. But I think that in terms of the influences on Prebic, more than Caldor, the fundamental influence on Prebic is Furtado. So I would think that Furtado's idea, even if Furtado indirectly is influenced by Caldor and some other authors, I think that Furtado is the ultimate source, because I don't think Prebic bought that initially. So if you look Prebic 63, he's still very much talking about industrialization. He's still talking about now more so about diversification of exports. You have to still sell commodities. Why? Because you still have to avoid the external constraint, but you have to move into, the Aníbal Pinto's idea of eliminating the structural heterogeneity. And so there is a movement in still in the direction of talking about the industrialization and avoiding the external restrictions. So the fundamental conception when he goes to UNCTAD is to promote policies, I think it's, I'm still there, but it's to promote policies that eliminate this external restriction. It's supposedly a notion that, he gets close to the Bandung sort of countries. You have to open up and liberalize the north, the center, and you have to industrialize and diversify the exports in the periphery. That's fundamentally the arguments that he's pursuing there. So this is more or less what Carlinhos was talking about. So the idea that these ideas were widespread. I pick up perhaps a slightly different sort of set of authors. So I cite here, I think Baran and Suisi and Furtado by the mid-60s are the two classic papers on the stagnationist thesis. These become very important. My guess is that more influence on Prebic is having read these things in the 60s from Furtado than the Caldor paper or certainly Baran and Suisi. So he wasn't really a Baran and Suisi guy. He was more of a Furtado guy. And so in that respect, I think that that's the origin of that sort of stagnationist thesis. But he never says that. That's the interesting thing. At UNCTAD, he will fight until he retires in 1970, essentially for dealing with the issues of export promotion. So let's put it that way. And it's in the 70s, as I told you at the beginning, that he sort of, with this book, the only sort of book, it's not translated into English. So the sort of lack of penetration of Prebic and Prebic's ideas in the center are sort of an incredible, sort of thing. And so the book was never translated into English. It would actually reinforce in many ways the view of Furtado, the view of Prebic as a radical dependency theory guy in the global north. It sort of suggests a bunch of things that are very close to what Carlinhos was saying. So here he embraces the idea that the problem is the consumption of the elites. He uses more explicitly and more clearly and with more intent ideas that are heterodox, radical. So he goes to Marx. He says that he learned part of that from the Uruguayan sociologist that I'm not going to block the name, that was the co-editor of ECLAC Review. So he's exploring those ideas. He's using more explicitly. Furtado does use. If you read Furtado's 1959 book, he's all the time talking about the surplus. So there is a notion of how the surplus is extracted from in the system of production, so to speak, and in that sense, very classical sort of. But with a tendency here, and that's the point that we suggested with Esteban, and he actually quoted us, so that there is little with a tendency to accept says law. So there is sort of an acceptance of says law. So here I'm going to deviate a little bit of my thing and say a couple of things that are not necessarily here. So I think that in that sense, so just to close that sort of argument before going to what I think is relevant for this conference, Prebic actually in that respect, yes, sure, he's more radical. He's explicitly citing Marx. He's talking explicitly about the surplus approach. But he's also using Say's law. And he's also moving away from the idea of the external constraint and moving away from ideas that are compatible with demand-led sort of models. Caldor, by the way, here's why the Caldor. Caldor does the exact opposite thing. Caldor, in this period, by the 60s, it starts moving in the direction of the external constraint. As Prebisch moves in the direction of secular stagnation, Caldor, I know, Caldor, I'm even more danger because I have Fabio Freitas here, and he has this sort of other model. But, I'm not saying that his final thinking. His papers, he published Thirlwell's Law, which is where this sort of comes from this discussion just on the demand side. So I'll let you guys sort of bash me, and that's fine enough. But the point is, if you do that, what you have is that the first heterodox, and forget that Monza did it in Argentina and ECLAC did it in, so forget a lot of details that are irrelevant. I'm right. And Caldor is the first to do this sort of heterodox version. It's very popular. It's, before the super and this super conference became sort of the popular trend in economics, it was the Thirlwell's Law. You had papers and dissertations on Thirlwell's Law and Tuvalu. And part of the story is because it was one of the two sort of important ways in which people thought, at least in American academia, heterodox people, about growth. And so it was, they used the word supermultiplier. Thirlwell and Dixon used the word supermultiplier. I agree, it's not a demand-led model. It has lots of problems. They only have, we had a debate on this in which I do criticize Thirlwell and blah, blah, but that it's an investigation economica. But my point is, there was that sort of connection. Having said that, where does this move away and allows us to extend, the sort of development of these ideas? And I think it starts with Conceição Tavares. It starts with the paper by her and José Serra, Beyond Stagnation. That's when they are criticizing Furtado's, 1960s stagnationist thesis. And that eventually leads to the development of ideas that are connected to, the nascent by the 70s heterodox traditions of demand-led growth. Eventually you get I've heard of this guy, I don't know, never met him, Serrano, that did a paper on the basis of that on the supermultiplier. And so there is a tradition that builds from Prebisch and Furtado with those differences and whatnot into, Conceição Tavares and Serra, and from Serra and Tavares into the sort of heterodox traditions that, here represented by, Professor Medeiros and Franklin Serrano. So there is a sort of a way in which the more heterodox views, if you want to call it that, of the external constraint, and the notion that the external constraint is important, that before you hit any supply constraint, you're forced to, stop growing because you have this external constraint. And, because we have inflation, that it's distributive and it's a problem. And we know in the region that if you devalue, you end up, squeezing wages, and, that has at least a contractionary sort of impact. And so there is an understanding, forget the inflation theory, and it is from there that the word structuralist comes from. So it's the structural inflation. There is a notion there that conflict and the external constraint, the lack of dollars, if you want, are the limitations on growth, a growth that hence, even if you wanted to stimulate in the short run, because Prebisch is thinking more or less in the short run in his writings of the ECLAC period and the ECLAC period. That if you do those things, although he's thinking of structural transformation too, but those contradictions are there, I think. So if you get that, he moves, although he moves away from those, there is a connection between that phase, the more radical phase of, the external constraint into the models of demand-led growth. Thank you.
Before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. My first time, and it's really a pleasure to be here and to share some of our work. I would like to start with this quote by Furtado about the Latin American structuralist school, which in the end says the progress thus obtained was made from a certain system of general statements that we could call traditional, because it was very close to conventional economic analysis. it was about transforming parameters into variables. But the theorizing effort within that framework has been in a phase of diminishing performance for quite some time. Its effectiveness at the explanatory level has been very modest. It's not a very good evaluation of structuralist school. And this was written in 1978, a little bit before the debt crisis, which really actually plunged ECLAC into complete silence because ECLAC didn't have a lot to say about the debt crisis, and then came the Washington Consensus. And the first thing I'd like to do is to try to understand how did we get there. I think the first thing with the structuralist, or the term structuralism, the term was coined during the monetary debates of the 1960s between the ECLAC school and the monetary school. That's where the term was coined. Not everyone within the ECLAC tradition or those development economists at that time wanted to be classified as structuralist, including Raúl Prebisch. In his notes on peripheral capitalism that were written for the ECLAC review in 1976, he sort of provides his analysis along the book that Matias mentioned, Peripheral Capitalism. And he says, well, I guess his conclusions are going to be thought as being structuralist. And then he says, I don't like to classify people, and I don't like to be classified. And then further along, he says, during the debate of the sort of ECLAC school and the monetarist point of view, the pendulum swung too much to the structuralist views. Actually, Raúl Prebisch was absent during the entire debate. That's the first thing I'd like to say. So if we got there, a first reason is that the group that developed this developmental theory had heterogeneous, diverse ideas, and sometimes that led to conflict, even between Furtado and Prebisch. A second reason sometimes is the lack of clarity in the ideas. The terms of trade, if you read the 1949 article by Prebisch, which is called the Prebisch Manifesto, is related to wage resistance. It's related to the organization of labor, not really to the productive structure of countries, which you will also find in the early writings of Prebisch in ECLAC 1952, which he then abandons for a more structural view. A third reason is a refusal to escape neoclassical theory altogether. If, for example, you read Prebisch, Prebisch did not like Keynes' general theory. He thought it was a mistake. He thought he had gone backwards, that the treatise on money was much better. The Wicksellian principles had to be what economic theory was about, and that Keynes had completely muddled himself in the multiplier and the liquidity preference. Prebisch always believed that savings determines investment, and he stated several times, I don't see how we can increase investment without reducing consumption first. He relied on forced savings to explain profit sometimes, and a lot of so-called structuralist economists, like Carlos was saying, had a focus on supply. And he quoted Sunkel. And I remember at ECLAC in one seminar, Sunkel would say, enough of demand, the focus has to be on supply. And a fourth reason is ambivalence sometimes. The structural debate on inflation and those views that you can find as being, inspired by Kaleski and Orjak, and that you can find initially in Furtado 1952, and then in Noyola in an unpublished manuscript in 1956, and then in Sunkel have some very, what we call Keynesian ideas. Money is endogenous, there's the issue of conflict inflation, and then at the same time, there are all these rigidities. And the way neoclassical economists responded to the rigidities is through the problem is a micro problem, not a macro problem. And this is basically why I think we got to the point, or we got. My point of view is that structuralism was a vision, but it never achieved the status of being a theory. Joseph Love, which studied the structuralists for a long period of time, he referred to ISI, in import substitution industrialization. And you can replace the term by structuralism as that it was a practice before being a policy, and a policy before being a theory. But it never got to the point of a theory. If one reads Perez and Furtado and other economists at the time, their point of view of economic development, social economic development, and the views that they were putting forward was that they were trying to rationalize what the bigger countries in the region were actually doing. And in particular, in the case of Brazil. The main, if I don't want to be reductionist, but if I were to summarize what the vision was, it would be in those three areas. The idea of center-periphery, which Perez coined in the 1940s, perhaps earlier, but what he called the United States a cyclical center, when he mentioned that the United States could just increase money supply as a counter-cyclical monetary policy without regard to their parities, but that was impossible to do in the periphery, and then he goes on to say, I hate all those controls, but we have no other choice. How the periphery inserts itself into the center, and those two categories that just negate each other. It's very Hegelian, like the center has everything that the periphery does not have, and the periphery does not have things that the center has. And then we have also the issue, second, the issue of composition, which is sometimes missing in a lot of economic textbooks. Macro textbooks are focused basically on aggregates, but we forget all the composition, the structural heterogeneity, the productivity differentials, the informality in labor markets that has macro effects in macro effects in the economy. Planning, I'm going to leave outside, because that was a key issue for Perez ever since he was at the Central Bank of Argentina. And all of this was driven by what they call the historical structural method. And that was a term that was coined by Sunkel and Paz in 1973, the idea of observing the reality in order to draw some conclusions, like color stylized facts, and then on that basis trying to understand the characteristics of the center, the periphery, and how the periphery is inserted into the world economy and the composition effects. And the next part of the presentation would be to try to use some of these categories like center, periphery, the composition, to try to highlight some elements that could be part of a theory in today's context, today's economic context, for developing economies that sometimes seem to me that are missing in many macro textbooks. And I would like to start with the famous external constraint. And this is a graph that shows the number of years, the countries are able to sustain a 2.5% deficit in terms of GDP, and then also in the case of Asia. And on the vertical side, you have the frequency of cases. 19 cases for 1 year, and then you go for 2 years, nine countries were, 2 countries were able to maintain it for 9 years, and you have exactly the same pattern in the case of Asia. And this is a point that Perez made, that countries, it's not a question really of the long run, but countries do not able to maintain for very long balance of payments deficits. And obviously, the second point is the idea, and this was put also by Perez, that income effects predominate over substitution effects. And you would see, for example, histogram of the variation of effective real rate, exchange rate that turns around 0, but that doesn't happen with the rate of growth of exports or the rate of growth of imports, just to show something very, very simple. And the whole idea of how Perez came to this idea, the external constraint, had to do with the center, had to do with the forms of propagation of technical progress. And it was these forms of propagation of technical progress that imposed in the periphery one way to develop, and that was called industrialization. And it was the need to industrialize because of what was imposed from the center through technical progress that led to 2 disequilibria that sort of guided the whole work of ECLAC and Perez from 1950 to 1961, or 1963 when he joined UNCTAD. The external constraint and import substitutalization reduced the import coefficient, and then inflation. And those were the 2 guiding points. I think that if we look today at the balance of payments constraint, the third world model was developed by third world 1979, but if you go to the ECLAC review, in 1976, in a footnote, Octavio Rodriguez, which was a disciple of Perez, has the same equation as third world 1979. Now, curiously, third world, when he developed the balance of payments constraint, 1979, it's for developed countries. There's not a single developing country. And in 1994, he talked about the finance, how important it was to introduce finance, or the short-term financial flows that he calls that now exist. And in the same book it says that the important variable for balance of payments constraint is the basic balance, not only the current account. And that's very important from my point of view, because that links a little bit Perez and also Kalecki, because this is a similar criticism that Kalecki made in 1948 to Keynes' plans not to use the current account as an index of external disequilibrium, but to use the current account plus long-term investment. If you read the definition of balance of payments constraint, he obviously, McCombie and Thirlwell, talks about financial markets and how that constrains the growth of the economy. And I think if we're going to talk about center periphery, I think it's important to look at finance and how that finance comes into place in the current account. It is possible that initially finance was absent from the external constraint because we were looking at developed countries where finance was not that important as it is so important in developing countries. Here you have, this is a graph that shows short-term flows as a percent of total flows from 2003 to 2019, and then 2019 to 2010, 2019. The short-term flows include not only what, portfolio flows, but they also include intercompany loans. that are not included in the FDI debt instruments. The intercompany loans tend to behave like short-term financial flows. And I think those stylized facts are important to take into account. A second stylized fact that I think it's important to take into account is the relation in the financial side of the balance of payments relating to sovereign risk. And sovereign risk is highly related to the rate of change of the nominal exchange rate. That is, when the nominal exchange rate changes, the causality goes from nominal exchange rate to sovereign risk, and sovereign risk determines non-financial corporate risk. And there you have a line of causation from changes in nominal exchange rate to perhaps risk that affects, for example, the investment decisions of firms. And this is also part of being in the periphery. That risk just goes up just immediately when there is a devaluation, depreciation of the exchange rate, let's say because of capital outflows. Now, in general, this I think does not apply so much to Brazil, but it applies to other countries. The neoclassical solution to deal with this type of sort of fluctuation, disequilibrium, is to develop local debt markets. But the way I see it is not so much whether debt is issued into local currency, is who owns the debt issued in local currency. And if foreign directors have an important share of that debt in local currency, it doesn't matter, because if there is a depreciation, they're just going to leave change and leave the country. And obviously, this leads to the question of how can the central bank, or can the central bank intervene to avoid, let's say, a decline in bond prices, buy the bonds, increase the bonds, and to what extent they can do that without there being a capital flow because the rate of interest goes too low. This is another aspect of what I was mentioning before in terms of financial flows. This is outstanding debt of, for Latin America, of private banks, non-financial corporation, and general government. And you will see that up until the global financial crisis, really the only agent that got into debt was basically the government. And that after the financial crisis, both private banks and non-financial corporations really increase their debt. And I think this is sometimes absent in some of the models, and certainly it's absent in the third world model, because I think it's not only a question of debt sustainability and debt flows. For example, as explained by Macombi and Thurwell in 1999, the debt levels also are important. And I can stabilize at a debt level that has a positive relation to investment, or I can stabilize at a debt level that has a negative relation to investment, and the end result will be different. And those thresholds that sort of dictate or that shape a nonlinear relation between debt and investment can change over time rapidly. Finally, I like to focus, this is out of, I don't know why it's out of place, the income, GDP, and expenditure. Having a center periphery means working with an open economy. I don't think today many countries in Latin America using GDP is a variable that really captures an open economy. If you read, for example, the book by Godley and Cripps, the last chapter, when they talk about the open economy in real terms, they refer to national income. And national income captures because it takes into account the terms of trade, besides GDP, and remittances. And for me, this is a very important measure because it can relate demand to the productive structure. The TTE in that equation, I'm sorry, I don't know why it came like that. The TTE in that equation, it's the terms of trade effects. And when there's a commodity boom or there's a commodity decline, one can use this to capture that productive structure in the same thing that one can use it for remittances, and I'm going to give you 2 examples. This is the case of Colombia, national income and GDP, and you see the differences in between national income and GDP. And obviously, when you have a higher rate of growth of national income relative to GDP, the economy is much stronger than you think. And actually, if you evaluate a lot of ratios in terms of GDP, they're much higher. Maybe your debt is much lower than you think, and maybe you have much more fiscal space than you actually ever thought you had. And this idea of using national income in terms of GDP not only links demand to the productive structure, but obviously links also income to the distribution of income, which you can do to GDP unless you assume GDP equals product is equal to income. And if that income is determined between profits, the profit share, let's say, and the wage bill, then you have the factor distribution of income. And if the factor distribution of income determines the personal distribution of income, like, for example, Atkinson says, beyond a certain threshold of profits, the profit share, then you have a direct link of causation from demand and structural supply to functional and personal distribution of income. And obviously, if we don't capture this gap in GDP, we're missing a big part of the explanation of distribution and of the explanation of the economic performance of an economy. I want to show you also the same idea, for example, for a smaller economy, Dominican Republic. The first graph shows the contraction during COVID in terms of GDP, when the contraction was actually half the contraction everyone thought because of remittances. And the same thing occurs with smaller economies, and the other is the difference in percentage points of growth between national income and GDP. And I'm going to stop right here, but it is some of these factors that I think can capture that thing of center and periphery that can, and composition effects that were so important to the structuralists that may allow to build something that may be more successful than what structuralism proved to be. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Esteban. Actually, thank you, Carlos, Matias, Esteban, for your speech. So we are now going open to the audience for questions. We will collect 3 questions, and then our guests answer, and then we collect more 3, okay? So, Franklin, do we have another microphone? Okay.
First, Esteban, I would like to congratulate you. That's very interesting talk. Do you have the thing written? You should. and because you emphasize something that is important for the other discussions, to separate this more, the approach, the structuralist approach, how we do research, how we organize center periphery, the historical thing, is largely independent for specific models and theories and other things. This is very, very, very important. And often people don't understand how come we can like people so much, people who use says law. It's not anybody who uses says law. It's a very peculiar thing connected to these things. I have one question about your, because you went very quickly, only one question. You said there was a causality from the changes in interest in exchange rates to the country risks isn't it the opposite? I mean, all the work we have done should go in the different direction, no? And so this is the really question for you. Another point is that it's a very interesting point is that it is true that not only Godley, but most of the macro textbooks in the old days of the developed countries use national income, and of the developing countries use GDP. The reason was just that we are net debtors and we wanted our output, our income to look bigger. However, I believe we were right by accident, because GDP is the proper measure for output. It doesn't make any sense to use national income as determined by effective demand, for instance. It doesn't make any sense. However, we are right about that. But when talking about income, who owns that output? So for distribution, particularly, of course, countries that have a lot of multinationals, this is very important for distributive issues. So it's more, in my view, the question of what are you using it for? I would never use it for output because it doesn't make sense. So, and also the comment for Matias and Carlos together is, the first has more to do with Matias. Matias, I don't understand how can it be helpful to confuse the external constraint with demand thing. External constraint is not demand, is not supply, it's financial, and it does show that you should take a lot of care on the supply, not on demand, because you have to change the elasticities. I think this is was obvious for Perez. So I don't think our criticism of the Caldentey model that will be shown by Barry is that this tendency of mix the two. So by calling the by Caldentey, you just, again, by trying to find out if the external constraint was demand and supply, it's not helpful. So, this really does not help. For the other thing is that, so for instance, Perez did not move away from the foreign constraint when he talked about the surplus. He just was talking about the internal constraint. And all these people, said Paul, we like them because of what they say about the external constraint, which is a constraint, and it will happen, whatever is your internal constraint. For instance, in Furtado and Perez, the internal constraint was savings. In January, also. And so what? It's external constraint. Like, we just replaced the internal constraint from savings to demand. So I think this has been clarified more than 20 years ago, at least in the corridors here, so please don't. No need to do that, only increases the confusion. And the other point is about the supply thing. First of all, Carlos, please do not do, at least in front of Fabio Freitas, say that the Cambridge distribution mechanism is demand-led. You're going to get in big trouble, because the Cambridge distribution mechanism is a mechanism to adjust aggregate demand through changes in distribution to a given exogenous level of supply. So I wouldn't do that. So increase even more the confusion. And even regarding the Says law and all the things, if you look carefully at this super multiplier of that good-looking guy, what's his name? The modest one.
40s.
No, the other one, the beautiful one. You see that there is a little thing called the maximum rate of growth, which is the upper limit for demand-led growth, which is, simplifying a bit, the same thing as the von Neumann rate of growth, given the real wage, which is there to talk about the supply side, to say that you won't be demand-led if autonomous demand grows so much that it induces, for instance, 100% of GDP of investment. Of course, it cannot happen. So it's a necessary condition for demand-led growth to have a surplus, but because there is no Says law, firms only invest if autonomous demand grows. This is very simple. It has been written for more than I don't know, almost 30 years. And again, there's no need to put the two things. So what we can say nowadays is that what our friends in CEPAL, our mentors, they worried about the necessary condition for development and assumed the necessary was already sufficient. The necessary condition for the development is fast capital accumulation. Fast capital accumulation depends in the long run, whatever theory you use, from a high investment share. This is only compatible, and since you have to, the weight share has to be consumed, the surplus has to be big. Now, they thought it was not problematic, either the market or the state, probably they thought about the state, to actually make that high rate of share of investment happen. We know nowadays it's not so simple, and I think why, so if this is the case, there is no problem, as long as one understands what is the constraint, what is a necessary condition, what is the actual determinant of growth, there is no need to make this big mess of, and what really, for no reason. And just a final point, there was a Polish guy called Caldentey, there was an Austrian guy called Steindl, that did long-run demand-led growth way before the 70s, Matias. So I don't understand all these very confusing references, okay? Yeah, of course. Next.
Sure. So I'm not sure I understand very well because Matias and Esteban went very quickly on the issue, but I think I grasped a disagreement on the interpretation about Prebisch in terms of trade issue. I think Esteban mentioned that the role of real wage resistance in the north, in the core, was something that came from Prebisch's difficulty to move away from neoclassical analysis, and I think Matias said that this was a classical political economy stand. So maybe you could say a word on that. And also to Pinkus related questions that I think maybe one missing point on your comparison between structuralism and classical political economy was exactly this one, that the structuralist view really brought the role of relative prices in determining distribution also across countries and how these core economies could appropriate on a higher part of surplus due to that. So maybe you want to say something about it too.
Thank you.
I have two questions for any of the panelists. What is the relationship between structural Keynesianism, as was presented by two of you, and structural Keynesianism as presented by Tom Paley? And the second question is, what about the hierarchy of currencies? Is that part of structural Keynesianism?
Okay, it's because they call the, frankly, because they call the Keynesian model of distribution. Okay, that's what Claudio says. But okay, Guilherme, I don't know. I don't think you mentioned that the structuralist model has the center periphery as the center of the theory, and the classical doesn't have. Agree. I think. I thought that I had mentioned that on my presentation, but anyway, I think it's the most important difference. Besides, I think one thing that I would like to say, I love the graphic with the tree on the left side and the division of this one. I would ask the same question, there's a paper on that, so I can put on my article. Anyway, I think it's very important, the separation between the specific elements of theoretical elements and the broad approach. I try to do that, maybe not very successfully, but anyway, I try to separate the broad. That's because I separate first the methodology, then the accumulation of capital, then the inflation, and try to stress that the methodology of both approaches, development theory and structuralism, Latin American structuralism, are different, and at the core of this difference is the center periphery approach that is much more than just trade imbalance. It has to do with finance, it has to do with geopolitics and a lot of important elements that relate to that. So I agree entirely with this. And then, Matias.
So, first the easy one, Guilherme. No, it's a confusion. So he said the wage resistance was central to that paper and that Perez had difficulty in getting rid of neoclassical stuff. We both agree that he had difficulty in getting rid of neoclassical stuff, and then in that particular thing, he's eclectic, so he had classical stuff, neoclassical. He read Marx and Pantaleoni, and yeah, so it's a mess. In many respects, it's a mess, and it's all in there. So that part, the sort of classical stuff appears. I think the classical stuff appears when he thinks of historical things. So he thinks of power, geopolitics, wage resistance. When he thinks of politics, and the broad issues of development and in historical context, he's ahead of his time. So I think he's better than many of the other sort of people that will eventually become, heterodox economists or whatever you call it. So, and that goes to what he said of the which I didn't put there, but he never uses the term, but the idea of the historical structural method. If you ask me, the two great examples of the historical structural method are the books by Furtado. Again, has, short-run effective demand at least, and has distribution conflictive. Perez never has the distribution conflictive when he talks about inflation. He remains, and he's absolutely right, so we agree on that too. When you look at Perez in the 60s, by the 80s, he still talks about inflation in terms of excess demand, Not monetarist, but, but so he criticizes Friedman, but remains in that respect. So, I think the following thing. So when you talk about these kinds of authors that are somewhat eclectic and think in historical terms, I would be going exactly to the point that you have to separate the analytical models from the sort of broad use of the theory, so which I agree 100%. That there is a danger in exactly, for example, in Caldor 2, and I read Fabio's thesis, so I'm aware on the sort of Vesper's nest that I'm getting when I say something along those lines. But I say it on purpose because I think that there is something here of what I'm saying. So I think that, for example, Caldor, if you read Caldor of the historical papers, the Caldor about the Industrial Revolution, it's absolutely clear that he thinks in terms of the demand-led model and that he thinks that, it is the exports. He has an explanation of the Industrial Revolution in England, which is based on export-led growth. I think it's incorrect. I don't think in England was so. There is a whole debate in England on that, and he's cited on a particular debate. So if you take that as being Caldor, and I think that why not? He's talking about, this is the interpretation of the historical understanding of, and certainly Thirlwell thought of that as being the explanation of growth. And so in that sense, I don't disagree. Of course, it's just a constraint. I said it's not a model of growth. That's the problem. If you look at my reply to Jaime Ross in Investigación Económica, I said this is not a model of growth, has a lot of problems. Yet, at least when he reads the constraint, if you read the constraint right, Thirlwell is reading it in the correct direction. So if you expand the demand, you're going to hit this thing. So not the Krugman's 45-degree line sort of argument, which is the way Jaime, I'm sorry to say, was reading that at that time. And so, so that's the way I think about Perez. So Perez is, you're right, analytically you can have both. You have an internal constraint and an external constraint. But it is important to understand that Perez moves from a discussion in which all of his concerns are historically, again, I said, what Perez brings to theory is center-periphery. And we think about geopolitics of development. And he's telling you, historically, our issue and our problem is that, we have this constraint. This constraint, of course, by itself is not a model. I'm saying it's compatible with models in which you do it by the demand side. In the neoclassical story, normally those things do vanish because they don't think of any difference about the external constraints. So they do some idiocy. I'm perhaps too much in the Argentinian debate that you devalue things and substitution effects drive you and there is no actual external constraint. So I probably should put a footnote that it's driven on that. I don't think Perez is not thinking along those lines. And that's something in Argentina. And so the emphasis of peripheral capitalism is 180. And that historically says something, that he doesn't discuss at all the external constraint of being relevant, the guy that brought it up. So I don't disagree with what you said. Regarding Steindl, more complicated answer. Regarding Steindl and Caldentey, sure, but what I was trying to, that's why I said it, I don't think at that time, when Prebisch is doing this, in the 50s and 60s, there was a debate or there was a sense. So for example, I define heterodox economics as being two things. So you have conflictive distribution and effective demand in the long run. And I don't think, so we have that debate on to what extent that's central or not central. It's the minimal program. It's a big tent, so I want to have some people that have exogenous, so there are some people that, I'm fine. Money sometimes can be exogenous. You're the first to say that under certain circumstances. So I want to keep Franklin Mark I inside the tent of heterodox economics. But fair enough. So I can put it too. So yes, fair enough. So that's another discussion. My point was, I don't think it was clear in the 50s and 60s. That's what I meant there. So I don't think it was clear in the 50s and 60s that this was a difference between us and them, so to speak. I think that there was an issue that was coming clear. So there was the short-run issue of effective demand. There was a thing that was coming to a fore on the long run, but it wasn't clarified. And the capital debates defined the issue of the theory of value. So that was, so I don't think until the 70s, I don't think that this was clarified. So I don't think you could have had those models of super multiplier. I mean, it's rare. So you have what Garagnani started to think about those things in the 60s, and then Ackley, and then so that's my thing. They're like, and my joke that if you forget everything that happened, I'm still right, and I agree with that. I tend to agree with myself. So my point is that those things were happening, but they were not systematic to the understanding of theory. By the 70s, they become systematic. So, but I don't have a fundamental disagreement with you. So I think that but I do think that the historical interpretation is important. So Prebisch does switch, and there is a switch that goes in the wrong direction. So, and it points to something about his views of what happens in capitalism. He also thought by the 70s, by the 70s and 80s, he sees something that is absolutely incorrect and that goes against, for example, Conceição. Not only Conceição is moving in demand growth-led models or thinking in the direction that would lead to that, she's also suggesting by the 80s that US is not losing hegemony. Prebisch is exactly saying that, and that will allow me to say something about Mark and hierarchy of money. So he thought that it was the end of American hegemony. And as much as he was absolutely correct on the transition in the 30s, he was absolutely wrong. So by the 80s, he's wrong on everything, in a sense, if you know what I mean, which is sort of funny because it's the first time that, for example, he didn't support a military coup and he was for democratization and was, the first time that he's progressive politically in Argentina, which is sort of funny. So he became progressive politically, but in his economics, the emphasis he gives. So I'll be more careful with my language, but that's the point. I don't think we're in great disagreement, but I do think that there is still something important to the way we're framing the argument. Structural Keynesianism. So, in the spirit of a big tent, we'll have Tom in the tent, and actually the idea using the term comes from the fact that he used the term. We use it slightly differently. So I don't think that Tom has an understanding of necessarily of structuralism in Latin America in the way we do have, or center-periphery. But I'll say that Tom is always willing to change and move, and has moved in certain direction that I think it's closer to what we think. And so I think that those differences have sort of shortened. And so I think he tends to think of structural in ways that were more connected, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but not so much about the stuff we're talking, center-periphery, the kind of structures of production. I think Tom is thinking more in terms of Tobin kind of and he does think about the hierarchies of money and yes, and he does think about institutions. So there are certain differences in the way he approaches this, but I don't think they're all incompatible, and I think we're moving into something that it's closer. So, but again, there might be space to debate, what are the differences. So, if you look at, I was trying to get out of this and show the, because Carlinhos is the one that had actually our table. So which one was yours? It was this one? No. So if we do this, yeah, no, it is. I'm just going to show the, oh, oops. Okay, boom, 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 boom. It's the first one. So if you look at the story, so this was three things: the source of variety, the views on the role of market, and the sources of economic growth. And so, and again, you can't fit everything here, so we can have a long discussion, on how correct this is or not. And so, I don't want to bother anybody, but oops, no, this passes. Where do you get the light? It's the one. Is this one? No. Yeah, it's too high tech for me. So the one on the top right, thing. So you have, if you want. Oh, set up it's the main. It's the most obvious. So okay. So you have, think of this, the micro sort of view, and it's efficient allocator of resources, and inefficient allocator of resources. We were talking the other day because we presented this in IPEA, and I said part of the, I call this now Neopolanian. I don't know if it's, but it's Mark Blythe and Lucio Baccar and whatnot. And because they get their economics from the profession, they grab a manual and they say, oh, what's heterodox? It's Stiglitz, and so it's imperfect competition. So they get this. And Franklin correctly says, you're too harsh on Sergio Cesarato that criticized this. And says, because he doesn't criticize this. And I think that the fundamental difference of the structuralists is we, as the classical authors, tend to think of the material reproduction of society and the surplus as central. So micro is our micro, conflict. Demand-led growth. They do have demand-led growth. So they adopted the neo-Keynesian models. And they might move. So these guys are the sort of neoclassical divide. What we don't have in this discussion normally is this part here. And the varieties of capitalism, they do have. And it's very conventional. These guys put some, political economy there. What we put, and, in the way I put it particularly, and we, in our discussion with MMT, is exactly the hierarchy of money. So that what allows for you to have this sort of ability, to spend, is that at some point, and what makes Western Europe different than the rest, so I'm going to be Eurocentric here, it's to a sense that they develop public debt and public banks, and they developed slowly, because initially you still have a constraint, you're tied to, gold and silver and so on and so forth. They develop a capacity to, spend more or less, borrow in their own currency and spend more or less without, the external constraint and so on and so forth. So that was sort of one of the stories so the hierarchy of monies enters in this story through there, so, and power relations or whatever you want to call it. So.
First, the issue of wage resistance. I was referring to Prebisch's 1949, the Prebisch Manifesto, the economic problems of Latin America and the Caribbean. And there, on the fourth volume of the works of Prebisch, I think it's page 405, he says, why do terms of trade tend to decline for the periphery? And he explains this not in a structural way, but through the cycle, which he developed before. And he says the price of manufacturing goods will fall less than the price of primary goods because the labor is much more organized in the center than in the periphery. And though they will resist a declining wages, declining cost of production, and this does not happen in the periphery. That's what I was referring to. And we were very surprised when we read this, because the traditional explanation of the decline in the terms of trade has to do with the structural features of Latin American economies, not with union organization and wage resistance. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is that Prebisch was very neoclassical in many things and remained throughout his life neoclassical in many issues, including the investment savings relationship. But if you read the last chapters of I think it's a fourth volume of the works of Prebisch, he was trying to build a theory of dynamics in which he was trying to incorporate time and space into center periphery. And for some reason, he does it through some kind of triangles, which are very similar to what you find in Hayek prices and production. So that's where his influence were coming. And when he was trying to explain, the upward phase of the cycle, he came through forced savings. It was forced savings, which increased prices, and then that increased profits, and entrepreneurs produce and hire, etc. That's what I was trying to say. Regarding the causation between exchange rate and risk, we did several causalities for the bigger countries of Latin America. And although it's true, we found causality sometimes going to risk for the exchange rate, the predominant line of causation was from exchange rate to risk. And if you look at what happened, for example, in terms of dollar appreciation in the last, after the pandemic, and then the debt and exchange rate, I think it was first exchange rates. Depreciation of exchange rate, the burden of governments increase, it's harder for them to pay the debt, and then you can get the downgrading in credit increases and so on. And if a foreign investor is investing in local currencies and there's an appreciation of the exchange rate, he's going to take the money out. And let's not talk about Argentina, what happens with the local, they take the money out also. So I think they're both, you can have explanation for both. Regarding the GDP and income, I agree that GDP is up. But I think income is a better measure sometimes of economic performance, okay? Because it's related to the structure of production, to remittances. For example, we did a technical assistance to Honduras. Honduras has 32% of remittances in terms of GDP. Are you going to leave that out? And even think if that goes to the informal sector. And as a result of the informal sector, you don't have the same capacity to tax. So if you can manage to capture that 32%, it gives you much more space in terms. And can you actually make the case to credit rating agencies to use income instead of GDP when countries report their debt? Why don't use both measures? And I think that's an important issue. In terms of currency hierarchy, a currency hierarchy is in the balance of payments constraint, and it's in Prebish. Yeah, that is made by
I make very short clarification to cause reaction by Matias Vernengo.
Vernengo, mas ficou.
Everybody loves Matias Vernengo, but not so much when you're trying to be reasonable, put everybody together. Everybody asks questions to make you explain the differences, not the commonalities. Now, I work on, floating dollar standards, all these things, but I do not consider myself as a member of this strange generic hierarchy of money thing, because they don't consider me part of the group. Because they do believe, and I don't, because I follow Lerner, functional finance, and all the things that I find very sensible in even MIT, that is impossible for a country to go broke in its own currency. And these people do think there is some strange connection between balance of payments.
So you think Brennan Ray?
No, talking about the Campinas people, not Ray. Not all MMT. Hierarchy of money is Daniela Prates and the Campinas people, and even Claudio. But this is, and that's why he asked also, of course, we want to see blood, not agreement. Do you really think there is something about that we do with internal debt in our currency?
On something we're not disagreeing. Let's clarify things. So who do you think it's the hierarchy of money? You think of Campinas?
Yes.
But don't respond for him. What is this?
It's in his book.
Please, guys.
He owns the conference, but but let Mark said what he thinks.
Well, there's Prates from she used to be from
Okay, you're
Campinas,
thinking of, so I didn't think of that.
but
I'm thinking of.
there are also German people who.
I don't. So you're thinking economists. I'm thinking Jerry Cohen and people like, so that's a hierarchy. Jerry Cohen is the guy that invented the idea of the pyramid of money and you're on the top and whatnot. So I don't, these people, it's like on this, and I actually think that the hierarchy of money, I think of Randy, and that's the part we agree on, Ray and, they don't think that they have a crazy and close to, the new developmentalist idea that all issues of constraints disappear if you devalue your currency. But having said that, the idea that you cannot default in your own currency, we're all in agreement. So that's what I thought we were saying about hierarchy of money. So if it is the notion that there is some imposition and constraint imposed by the external sector because they punish you, I have nothing to do with that. I have published significant papers saying that that's not what we say. So so I'm just reading of what you thought. I never thought that you would ask about that literature. So I thought it was something else.
So I think that we don't have much time, so one more question. No? Okay, sorry.
There was a comment in terms of structural Keynesianism of Thomas Paley. I think it's fairly similar to what we presented here in terms of structure and in terms of institution. He doesn't go so far as to talk about the integration of developing economies. I think he's talking more about developed economies. But I think the concept is very similar to take into account the context. For example, in Latin American economies, the multiplier that I know is very low in general. And you can ask yourself why. And obviously, the structure of production, the distribution of income impacts on the multiplier. And I think those are similar arguments as Tom uses when he talks about structural Keynesianism, seems to me.